can we ever really take back control? Quite a sort of thorny question. Just how much an elected government can do, particularly after winning an 80-seat majority in 2019. And the Conservatives have probably had their hands tied, both at home and abroad. How much do we really know about the web of domestic and global quangos that control our lives? And, obviously for the TPA, how much taxpayers' money is being spent on all of this? Can Whitehall ever be reformed? The TPA recently published some research on civil service headcount, and we figured out that it increased by over 100,000 between 2016 and 2023. A lot of this, of course, was driven by external events like Brexit and the pandemic, but post-pandemic, the numbers haven't been falling back after the emergency. They've continued to climb. So what we have is quite a top-heavy recruitment from the civil service too, and there was actually, during that time, a fall in operational delivery. So that is service delivery. So what we're seeing is quite a lot of top-heavy hires in the civil service. So very difficult to reform a structure like that. An excellent panel to address these questions. Chris Snowdon of the Institute of Economic Affairs. We have Miriam Cates, MP, Bim Afalami, MP, and Danny Kruger, MP. I'm going to just go from left to right, actually, and ask Chris to kick us off.
Sure. Thank you, John. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Good morning to you. I have a feeling that if the Conservative Party loses the next election, there's going to be quite a few autobiographies from ministers, various politicians, prime ministers as well, looking back on the 14 years and going, God, we didn't really achieve as much as maybe we could have done. You know, we banned plastic straws and a few other things, but 14 years is a very, very long time. And there'll be a lot of blaming of lefty lawyers and lefty charities and lefty unions and lefty civil service and lefty BBC and so on. And I suspect probably the people who read these books won't be that sympathetic to the claim that, you know, they were just stopped at every turn. They had all these wonderful conservative things they wanted to do, this not able to do them, because at the end of the day, these people are literally lawmakers. If they don't like the laws, if something's holding them back, they should be able to force things through, change the law if need be. But having said that, that doesn't mean there isn't a problem. It doesn't mean that it is probably more difficult for a Conservative government to do things than a Labour government because of institutional forces ranged against it. To take one small but very recent example, this 20-mile-hour limit issue. So, you know, Sunak says he wants to stop councils effectively introducing 20-mile-hour zones. Immediately a howl of outrage from all the usual suspects. A whole group of charities wrote a letter condemning the government for this. So this was a terrible backward step. And as I sometimes do, I looked into who these charities are. The main one was Sustrans, which I think stands for Sustainable Transport. They're a fairly explicitly anti-motoring pressure group. Last year they got £150 million revenue, of which 96 million came from Transport London and the Department of Transport. There was more government funding in there as well, but I thought 96 million is a fairly large chunk straight away. It's just more or less a small government department, really. It's one called Living Streets, previously known as the Pedestrian Society or Pedestrian Association. They had £5.4 million, of which 29 grand came from donations from the public, and basically the rest of it came from councils, Scottish Government, European Climate Foundation, but above all, several £1 million from the Department for Transport. And then there was one finally called Bikeability. I don't think I'd heard of Bikeability. They had a revenue of £18.7 million, of which £18.4 million came from the Department of Transport. Now, to be fair, they seem to run something called the National Cycle Training Programme, which I assume is a successor to the Cycling Proficiency Test. All well and good, but it's essentially just an arm of government. They got £1,200 from the public in donations. So you have this, and that's just one recent example that I mentioned purely because it was been in the news in the last few days. There is a whole bank of these people, a whole almost a shadow state of quangos and organisations and third party, theoretically civil society third party organisations, which in practice are very, very, very heavily funded by the state to the extent that they might as well be part of the state, but are very vocal on a lot of the issues and are always very vocal in a predictable way. Another thing I think the government gets wrong is commissioning independent reports from people who don't like them and don't really have any conservative principles. So why, for example, was Matthew Taylor, who used to be an advisor to Tony Blair, why was he commissioned to write a report about the gig economy? Why was Henry Dimbleby commissioned to do the food, whatever it's called, the food strategy? Not that Henry Dimbleby is some raving lefty, but his views about food are very well known, and it's fairly obvious what he's going to say. Particularly as soon as you get appointed to these jobs, you get surrounded by the single issue pressure groups, and if you don't know that much about it, they'll tell you what to think. Javed Khan, previously CEO of Barnardo's, was for some reason commissioned to write a review about tobacco, and again he got surrounded by the fanatical pressure groups, and he came up with this ludicrous report saying we should paint cigarettes green and so on. And what's the point of what does this serve? I mean, firstly, why can't the government come up with its own policies? Why do you need to go to some random bloke and say, what do you think? And secondly, why are the people you're going to not likely at all to come up with anything that is vaguely conservative or free market? So this succession of own goals. Speaking of tobacco, World Health Organization, okay, it has a limited amount of power over the UK because the UK is strong enough to come up with its own evidence reviews and is not dependent on WHO grants like many countries are. But nevertheless, there will be a delegation next month going off to Panama to this big WHO conference, which is putatively about tobacco, but actually is just a big anti-vaping rally these days. Now, the UK, touch wood so far, has had a very laissez-faire positive view towards vaping in getting people off cigarettes. The WHO's approach is diametrically opposed to that. They advise people preferably ban them, but if you can't ban them, introduce so much regulation that nobody's going to want to buy them. Not only are we going to go along to this thing and probably not say anything, we're the main funder of this particular stream. We're the third biggest funder of the WHO overall. Why, at the very least, are we not getting some soft power out of all these donations? And if we can't do that, why are we giving them money? So I think there's one basic point here is stop funding and supporting your opponents. It's a bit late in the day, perhaps, to say that now, but it's something to consider if you end up in opposition. And what I would say is, if it's really true that there are so many lefty lawyers and obstacles to reform that nothing's ever going to get done, well, you might as well all give up, okay? But I don't think that is true. I think it just requires strategic thinking, having some direction, giving the civil service direction. I don't believe actually the civil service is full of lefties. I think a lot of people in the civil service just want to do a good job, but they need to know what that job is. And it's not helped when the government keeps changing. It's certainly not helped where you keep changing ministers all the time. Ministers should be in the job for preferably the whole term of Parliament. You can see with Michael Gove in education what can be done if you have people who are prepared to take on the blob. You have Dominic Cummings there with him, who was very happy to make enemies, and being happy to make enemies is absolutely crucial. And you had a supportive Prime Minister. The minister was in the role for 4 or 5 years, and they actually got something done, and education tangibly improved, despite a huge amount of opposition from the teaching unions and all sorts of other people. So it can be done. I think the public realise that it can be done, and they quite rightly blame the government when they don't get things done. But I'm not saying it's easy, but you do have to have... Firstly, you need to have some principles. You need to know what you really want to do, and that's perhaps sometimes been lacking. But once you set yourself a challenge, drive it forward, ignore the opposition, ignore the voices. There will always be people, crying and shouting about any sort of change. It's vaguely in a conservative direction, and you need to understand that these people are never going to be your friends. They're never going to vote for you. So really, their opinion is of no importance.
A nice punchy and wide-ranging opening there from Chris. Miriam, we'll hand straight over to you.
Thank you. Well, I think Chris has covered the role of the civil service and charities potentially, and I do agree with Kemi Badenoch. I think she said yesterday charities should not be getting taxpayers' funding. So I'm going to focus on quangos because they do inhabit a role in the middle where ministers can't directly change their working as they could potentially with the civil service, but they also do have a role in law, unlike charities, which makes them a lot more difficult to overcome. And I just want to share 3 or 4 anecdotes of examples where these quangos have absolutely frustrated the democratic will and ended up in suboptimal outcomes, shall we say. So starting on a very local level, natural England is the bane of farmers' lives, and some of the rules that they've put in place have really disrupted British farming and made it had a negative impact. So I've got landowners in my constituency who used to manage the fire risk on their land by burning heather. you now have to get a heather burning licence. It's very, very difficult to get such a thing. And they are worried that there will be wildfires sooner or later because they're no longer allowed to manage the land as they wish. You can't undertake any significant building improvements or sports fields or things like that if there's a single bat in the vicinity, because you have to get a bat licence from Natural England, and it's very difficult to come across one. So even if there's an improvement that is unanimously approved of by the community, that everybody wants to see happen, a development that is universally popular, you can't do it because of a rule that Natural England have said, and there's nothing any minister can do about that. So that's on a kind of local level. I think nationally we've got big problems with the power of quangos like the OBR. I think they cost us about £4.5 million a year, and the Treasury seems absolutely enthralled to whatever the OBR forecasts seem to be, and the Treasury think they can't cut taxes, they can't make major reforms because of what the OBR is forecasting for 5 years' time. But as John Redwood frequently points out, none of the OBR forecasts are ever correct. And so until they've at least got a model that can predict what's happened in retrospect, why are we hanging on to their every word when it comes to future trends? And then I think internationally, Chris mentioned WHO. The UN have got some pretty powerful subcommittees that are completely unelected and unaccountable. CEDAW, the Committee on Women's Rights, recently a CEDAW committee ruling somehow compelled our own government to enforce sex education on Northern Ireland, a sex education programme that's going so badly in this country that the PM has ordered a review into it. But apparently, because CEDAW said Northern Ireland must have sex education along the same lines, it's going to happen. So I think the problem with these quangos is they occupy this middle space where ministers don't have direct control over them, and they do have legal function, but it's not like the charity section where in theory the government could just cut their funding. And I think we've really got to ask, how have we got to this position? And I think it's because ministers generally have become afraid of making decisions, and they want an air of neutrality to cover up their decisions, or at least to provide a foundation for those decisions, because the public think politicians are bad people who are biased. But everybody is biased, nobody is neutral, and that's just the same with the person who runs Natural England as the person who runs OBR. We all have our own life experiences, our own political views that we bring to the table. And the problem with quangos, unlike people in government, unlike elected politicians, is they only have one job. And so, of course, they see everything through that lens, and that makes it very difficult to recommend decisions that really are in the common good and fulfill a wide range of functions. So I think really the only way out of this is for our political culture to change, for politicians to actually have courage in making decisions because they think it's the right thing, from an ideological, from a moral, from an evidence-based perspective, and not relying on the supposed neutrality of these quangos to cover their decisions. And I suppose we can see that in action, because when the OBR says something we don't like, we say they're just a quango, ignore them. When they say our economy is doing brilliantly, we say, isn't this brilliant, what a great government we are. Well, we can't be both. We've either got to decide that we're not going to take notice of what these quangos say, or we've got to do exactly what they say, and I know which I prefer.
Thank you, Miriam. The Labour Party recently said they wanted to hand the OBR even more power were they to win office. And some Conservatives, George Osborne, cough, cough, said that that was a sensible and pragmatic move. So it's good to hear that there's some Conservative pushback against ideas like that. Bim, let's go straight to you.
Thank you, and it's always a pleasure to be the right of Miriam. I mean, what exactly? No, it's always a pleasure. So on the OBR, I don't think we should give them more power, but not for the reasons necessarily that Miriam set out. I just think that, and it goes to the heart of what we're really talking about here. On the OBR, the reason why the Treasury is quite content to give the OBR more power is Treasury people inhabit the OBR. And in the past, that was a Treasury forecast that was always had a certain degree of, people always used to debate the political neutrality of a chancellor and its Treasury putting out forecast, cue the European referendum where the Treasury put out its own forecast. You remember that, right? So people say, oh, it's the Treasury. But when it's the OBR, it's the same people with the same mindset. It actually makes the Treasury's job easier. So it's actually an institutional Treasury desire to grow the strength of the OBR rather than a political one. I think it would be a mistake if Labour were to win the election for them to do that, and I think they will probably rue the day they do that if they get a chance to. But look, what I want to talk to you about was regulation and regulators. You know, I'm chair of something called the Regulatory Reform Group, which we started about sort of January, February earlier this year with many colleagues, and the reason why I set up this group and why so many colleagues wanted to be involved in it is because our regulatory state is out of control. And I mean that not as a figure of speech, I mean literally out of control. Nobody controls most of these regulators. We have a situation in which, as Miriam was saying, we have deliberately, not by accident, deliberately put in place situations where elected governments and politicians cannot alter the direction of what a regulator is doing. At best, we have something called a strategic policy statement or something to that regard. Sometimes it's in statute, sometimes it isn't. If it's not in statute, the Cabinet Office has a sort of framework agreement with the regulator. When those things are in place, they're broad brush, they are strategic. They're intended to be. They're deliberately set up to outsource decision making. Now, in many senses, this makes sense, right? So it's important not to say that all regulators are bad, because actually, if we're talking about, I don't know, the grocery adjudicator, talking about how supermarkets deal with grocery prices and various things like that, I don't think we necessarily want government departments, they've got other things to do, they don't have to get into that minutiae. You've got, for example, the MHRA to do with drug approval, or NICE in the NHS. Again, there are often good reasons where you do want things to be done entirely separately and very straightforwardly so. But most of the time, you shouldn't. When you're talking about transport spending, when you're talking about Natural England, when you're talking about delivery of house building, when you're talking about economic forecasts, when you're talking about financial services, there are so many things that our constituents depend on us. They come to people like us and say, guys, this is hurting my business, this is hurting my community, I need you to fix it. And we will do our best, but quite often we come back and say, look, I'm sorry, we can't fix it. Can't you speak to the Chancellor or Prime Minister? No, even if I did, we still can't fix it, because the system is such that it prevents us from doing so. So the only way we deal with this problem, and regulators one aspect of it, there are others, is politicians need to regain their confidence and change the system. It's systemic. You know, a lot of politicians are not incapable, but have lost the habit of thinking in terms of structures. If you change structures, you can end up changing outcomes. It is very difficult, however brilliant any individual politician or group of politicians think they are, without changing structures, trying to get round existing structures is a lot less straightforward than just changing the damn thing. And I think that we need to regain the confidence in order to do so. I was struck by Chris's point about Michael Gove and education, and I agree with him. But isn't it sad? And Michael, by the way, is somebody he's a friend I have huge respect and time for. Isn't it sad that we're still talking about Michael Gove in this area? Michael Gove left that department almost 10 years ago, right? It's actually embarrassing that we are talking about Michael's admittedly brilliant time in that office. It was almost 10 years ago. And so I think that shows that we need to think about structures, we need to think about actually revolutionizing the system and saying, how do we bring control back to politicians who are supposedly getting elected to take decisions, not sort of acting like sort of local mayors in their towns or just sort of being gobby on the media, right? We've got to get back to a world where politicians want to take decisions, and the only way of forcing that world is to change the structures and forcing all of us and our colleagues to take real decisions that affect real people's lives.
Fantastic. Thank you, Bim. Last but not least, Danny.
Thanks very much. Okay, well, I think we're in agreement, and the penny is dropping among people in Westminster that the government doesn't run the government. And this is a terrible message for us to be saying publicly. The public absolutely hate it when you say something like that. They think that you're in power. There's huge polling evidence to show how deeply the public dislike politicians standing up and basically saying that their hands are tied and blaming the blob, blaming the civil service. We recognise the truth of it, but it's a very, very ineffective political message, and to which they come back and say, we elected you and we put you in power, and we're fundamentally not interested in strange constitutional arguments about checks and balances or the importance of arm's length advice or expertise that constrains ministerial decision-making. Of course, they deeply distrust and disapprove when we cite international obligations, international legal frameworks, because they rightly think, in my view, that the government is sovereign. And while it has to follow due process, and while the rule of law applies to government as well as to citizen, nevertheless, the sovereignty of this country rests in its elected government, and there should be nothing that constrains that, as long as proper processes are followed. So, while we need to fight this battle, it's one we need to simply win and get on with. I don't think it's one that we can have as a rallying cry. I mean, if we were in opposition and we could identify that, the Labour government were in thrall to a quangocracy that they themselves sympathised with, which of course was the situation before 2010, then we can take it on. But while we're in government, we just need to fix this. And Bim's absolutely right. We need to just create alternatives. So let me just try and explain what I think is the sources of the syndrome. And it does go back to the Blair-Brown years. It began on day one, actually, of their time in government when they gave the Bank of England independence, something that was widely applauded at the time. I think looking back, we can recognise what that actually did was begin the process of quangoification of our public life and set up in the bank an autonomous body that takes the most important decision that affects our economy without reference to political accountability and control. And we've seen in the 2 decades of easy money, asset price inflation, widening inequality, stagnation, low productivity, low wage growth, part of the consequences of this decision to put monetary policy outside political control. Of course, we followed it with our own decision to bind the hands of government on fiscal policy with the OBR, as colleagues have mentioned. And then we also connived at, in 2010, the establishment by Labour we colluded with by not challenging or revoking the creation of this vast legal framework, the Human Rights Act at the beginning of their time in power, and then the Equalities Act at the end, which has, again, exacerbated greatly the growth of a sort of parastate of willingly compliant, semi-independent officials, and indeed actors in the private sector as well who operate according to this framework, which takes its rise from an act of Parliament or acts of Parliament, but actually taken on a whole life of its own. So there's a huge challenge to undo. The natural tendency of bureaucracy to accrete power, to centralise and to grow, is well known, and to which we can only blame ourselves for allowing that to happen. I think more profoundly there's a philosophical source of this problem, which is the loss of a sense of what government is for. Really, the purpose of politics, in my view, is to create the conditions in which people can do well and do good. So ensure that the foundations of a good life are in place. And that means strengthening the natural institutions of families, communities, civil society, and a private sector that enable people to do the right thing by one another. Whereas we've developed the idea, particularly post-Blair, although, of course, it began under us, under John Major, really, and maybe even earlier, that the job of government was to step in and to mitigate the consequences of social breakdown. And of course, there is an enormous role for government in managing people, social problems. But fundamentally, the purpose of government is to create positive conditions for the good life, rather than to simply facilitate and to mitigate individual choice. So I think we have a philosophical problem. And then lastly, just the huge growth in demand on the state that has been created by this mistake, this idea that government isn't about creating good conditions, strong families, strong communities. So demand for the state has grown enormously, and we see that in all of the statistics. So what do we do about it? Well, partly the answer is to try and reduce demand on government, the huge growth in the public sector is the consequence of these chronic problems that we see in our communities and our society, of mental health problems, obesity, and generational worklessness. We need to do much more to mitigate to address the natural tendency of government to imagine that response to every crisis is another huge institution and parastatal organisation, including at the global level. And I think Chris mentioned the WHO. In the context of smoking, I'm far more concerned about what they're doing in terms of pandemic preparedness. There's now a huge movement going on globally to create essentially a world government that will have power to dictate to national governments what they should do, both in the anticipation of another pandemic, but also in the event of a pandemic. And the proposed treaty and the changes to the international health regulations that are being tabled at the World Health Assembly on behalf of the WHO are chilling, because they propose to arrogate to this unelected global bureaucracy the power to dictate health policy among member states. There can be no greater threat, I think, to our national democracy than that at the moment. I'm sure that the government won't stand for it. Thankfully, we do have a veto, but we need to encourage them to use it and not to let this through on the nod. And then finally, I think, actually, just to challenge something that Chris said about why can't government make its own policy, I actually think it is right for government to go outside itself to make policy, to ask people who actually know about a subject, who work in that sector, who are affected by the decisions, to input into decision making. I think closed policy making is less successful. But we need to ask the right people. As Chris says, it's not about just going to the usual suspects, to the vested interests. We need to be asking the right people and having a proper open policy making process. I would dismantle huge swathes of the Whitehall system and set government up. The role of government, in my view, should be to convene the conversations, the open policy making conversations that genuinely identify the solutions that are needed by asking the right people in the right way and being as wide-ranging in their consultation as possible. And I think, very much finally, that we need to have alternative structures. And the go of reforms, of course, was challenge the central model of education by now allowing schools to essentially opt out and allow challenger schools to set up, rather than trying to do huge top-down reform. I think which obviously would be necessary, would be ideal if we could do it effectively. But really, the best thing to do is to enable new institutions to arise, to deliver public services that are outside the control of the central system, show that they work, allow them to challenge the system, and then slowly or quickly, depending on political will, it will be possible to transition the mainstream into the new model that's being created. So we need to encourage that kind of bottom-up challenge to the incumbent system, rather than thinking that everything can be done from the centre. Okay.
All right, thank you very much. Just before we open out, I'm going to just have a couple of follow-up points, if you'll allow me. Miriam, you mentioned this idea that that politicians sometimes devolve their decision-making to duck difficult decisions. But they're not the ones that get shouted at by Nick Robinson on the Today programme. The quangocrats aren't. It's the politicians. So it seems to me short-sighted to say, right, okay, I don't want to make tough decisions, so I'll give it to a quango. But then who actually gets held accountable for it? It's the politician or the minister. Just sort of expand on that and the idea that politicians find it easy just to chuck a decision out to somebody else.
Well, I think politicians want backup for their decisions to make it look as though they've made the decisions for the neutral interests of the best, the good of all, rather than for their own political purposes. And of course, the best government occurs when those two things align. Of course, politicians make decisions in their own best interests in order to make them electable. But to become electable, you have to do things that people want. So surely that's a good thing. But politicians are part of the Westminster bubble, if you like, that has a particular set of interests that they are surrounded by all the time in Westminster and Whitehall, and don't necessarily align with the interests of ordinary people. And so I think sometimes politicians are too keen to please the media class, the Whitehall class, the quango class, and don't want to step out on a limb, and so would rather have the backup of that kind of supposedly neutral space rather than to make actual decisions that ordinary people would agree with. And I think just going off on a tangent slightly, but you can see what's happened to somebody like Suella Braverman, who said something that the majority of the population outside of London completely agree with and don't think is an unusual thing to say, don't think is an extreme thing to say. And when I knock on doors in Penistone and Stocksbridge, people say to me, "Tell Suella, well done from me." And yet you can see the kind of consternation amongst the political class about the comments she's made, because the politicians now have to go and defend these comments on the BBC and on the LBC and media outlets that have very different views perhaps to the rest of the country. So I think the quangos give politicians this veneer of neutrality and respectability that perhaps they wouldn't have without it. But you're right. The politicians are therefore taking the rap for decisions that they themselves haven't made. And as Danny said, sitting there in front of Nick Robinson and saying, it's not my fault, I can't do anything about it, just doesn't cut it with the public who think, I've given you an 80-seat majority, what more do you want? So as Danny said, although this is desperately needed, this reform, it's not something you can put in a manifesto and get credit for. So this is the challenge, especially having been in power for so long, is how do we dismantle some of the quangos that really shouldn't be there at all in a way that's possible and that we have the political capital for, but without making a big song and dance about it in the public. And I think that is a long-term project. But I think we could start by identifying some quangos that really are useless. There are some, like Bim said, that have a very important role, like medicines regulations and things like that. But there must be some that are so useless we could just scrap them.
Yeah, but the thing is, so how the regulatory reform groups try to look at this is trying to think of it in terms of what areas, almost not thinking so much about the individual bodies. It's like, what areas should politicians be actually taking decisions that we currently aren't? Take a couple of practical examples. A lot of things that have been devolved to Ofcom, Ofwat, water regulator, and Ofgem, the energy regulator, particularly energy over the last year, 18 months, are of such political significance that we need to, politicians need to be taking those decisions and answering for them. Because there's just no use politicians saying, oh, we're really sorry that, there's you having a hosepipe ban when it's raining outside, sorry, because we don't have a proper, system when it comes to water. And then we say, oh, sorry, it's Ofwat's fault. No, it's not. It is the political system's fault for not making the right decisions, the right investments at the right time. And the reason for that is because we've sought over generations. This isn't a problem over the last 5 or 10 years. Over generations, we've just gradually ceded more and more power. But of course, when you cede power, you cede expertise. So something we haven't mentioned as of yet is just the lack of expertise, the lack of understanding of huge swathes of the economic life of this country, because it's just not in Westminster. It's not in Whitehall. It is out in various bodies. So you then get a real problem, which is the people who know about things are either the big vested interests in the private sector or the regulator. They're the only two groups that know anything about it, because they're the only two groups that have been dealing with it for 10, 15, 20 years. And when you get to that position, it becomes harder and harder to take it in-house, because how would you even know how to do it? So I think that is something we're seeing. For example, we're seeing it with the CMA on digital markets. I'm very worried about that bill. I've had lots of discussions with the government on it, not because anybody's trying to get this wrong, but because the expertise when it comes to digital markets is basically in the big tech companies and the regulator and the CMA. Like, they're the people who know about it. So this problem can be very, very deep to unravel, and that's why we need to think systemically about it. And by the way, stop creating new ones at the same time.
But doesn't this come back to what Danny was saying about the size of the state? Because the state now provides and regulates so much. Someone has to do those jobs. And we can argue that the quangos aren't doing a very good job, or they're not accountable, and that some of them are completely unnecessary. But take the Online Safety Bill Act that's just gone through. There's a huge amount of work left to do on that in terms of drawing up the regulations. Ofcom are going to do all of that completely unaccountably by themselves. Now, that's not a good thing. But on the other hand, if Ofcom didn't do it, the government would have to. And whilst the state has expanded massively, the number of ministers and MPs hasn't. So, and that's not a bad thing. I'm not suggesting we double the size of the House of Commons. But somebody has to do those jobs, because life is now so complex and because the state provides so much. So the question is, who should do that job rather than whether or not the job should exist?
Yeah, really, just very quickly, Danny, you mentioned mission creep, bureaucratic overreach. the tendency for quangos to acquire ever greater functions. What can be done to really stop that? You know, we've talked in the past about sunset clauses, or you know, the idea that maybe quangos ought to report to the relevant select committee every year, not just to talk about their budget, but actually to talk about their mission and what it is they're doing. What kind of stuff can be done to stop that?
Well, I think that is part of it. I think the role of Parliament in managing the quango state is really significant and important, and that happens in other parliaments around the world. There's an expectation that Parliament will interrogate not just ministers but officials, and officials for these arm's length bodies as well. And that does happen a bit. The committees can bring people in, but the expectation is that ministers are just put up to with their briefing from the officials and are a sort of buffer between Parliament and where the real power lies. So I think that is part of it. I mean, this is not easy, this stuff. I mean, as I've suggested, it does go, I think, quite fundamentally into the idea of what government is for and what kind of society we want. And we get the government we deserve. You know, as the country has connived at, has enabled the growth of this huge bureaucracy. And we need to be very deliberate about reining it in. I think that's partly what our manifesto needs to be about. Let me just quickly mention a point about the monopoly of expertise that Ben mentioned. I think is really important, because somebody does have to hold the expertise, and it's true to say that in government there isn't enough of it, and hence they outsource to vested interests. I mean, Miriam mentioned Natural England, or rather DEFRA, have recently pretty much very closely destroyed the shooting industry in this country by withdrawing licenses for releasing pheasants because of concerns about avian flu getting into the wild bird population. Anyway, the people they consulted on this was RSPB, who are a dedicated anti-shooting charity. But it gave cover to the officials and ultimately to ministers to say, we've asked the experts. The people they didn't discuss were the gamekeepers, the people who actually steward the land, who point out that actually shooting conserves the wild bird population.
Did it get the right round?
How it went through government is an interesting story, which is probably not for public consumption because it doesn't redound to our credit. But basically, the system, and lots of very well-meaning, intelligent, decent people ended up nearly destroying shooting. I suppose my answer, John, is partly actually, and it might be controversial in this room, but I hope you agree. Actually, we need a stronger state. We need a stronger centre, a stronger, more strategic, not a bigger, a leaner, better, more capable state that actually does hold some expertise. And lastly, I think Miriam said that we need a medicines regulator, and as if the medicines regulator we've got is a good thing. It's absolutely terrible. The MHRA is responsible for huge amounts of harm that is being done, and that is largely because it is completely owned by the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, literally 80% of its money comes from Big Pharma, who of course are completely supportive of and encourage the MHRA to license their products. Actually, we need the state to do its job properly of protecting the public. And yes, they could be taxing the big pharmaceutical companies in order to fund that work. But that is a statutory agency. It should not be a self-regulating system, medicine regulation. So we do need the government to do its job. So a leaner, more effective, more strategic and more capable state is part of the answer to how to rein in the quango system.
All right. Enough from us. What about some questions and comments from the floor? We've got some roving mics. So if we've got a gentleman just on the left-hand side here.
Thank you. Do you think that the quangification of policy making is due to a loss of solid conservative knowledge and conviction among lawmakers, which some of them having such weak conservative convictions that we, as conservatives, sometimes are just puzzled about what they utter publicly?
Bim very keenly nudged me on that one.
I think that the distribution of conviction and ability amongst MPs is probably it's a broad spectrum and has probably always been. What I think is different now is the sidelining of Parliament that's happened over the last 20, 25 years. So even if you had the most robustly, authentically conservative group of people in the Conservative Parliamentary Party, the ability of those people to actually bring those convictions to bear on the system is so limited in comparison with before. So without rehashing what we've already said, I do think that the role of Parliament is so important, and Danny mentioned it. Parliament in this post-Brexit world can actually have a greater role by taking on the job of really scrutinising the act of the state, not just having a minister and shouting at them for 30 minutes, but actually looking at the bowels of the state and how it operates, particularly our regulatory state. Because if you did that before there was just a massive crisis, this is what we currently do, is when something goes wrong, we call in the head of whatever quango it is and say, why has this gone wrong? And that person is sort of terribly polite for half an hour, and then it gets to the end of the session when people have stopped watching, and the answer is, well, because nobody told me not to. And quite often, by the way, they ask for direction and they're not given it. The government department says, oh, that's for you guys. And so they are legitimately often very frustrated. They say, well, look, if we'd been told exactly what we should do, we'd do it. So I think that it's really about the role of Parliament and how do we enable Parliament to take a greater role in these regards. Because if you did that, then the Conservative convictions, or indeed if you elect a socialist government, by the way, that's right too. You know, they should bring their socialist convictions to bear on the system as well. That's what democracy is about.
Okay. Gentlemen, just on the, if you could mention your name as well, that would be helpful.
Sorry, my name's Chris. I'm a councillor in York. It's all very depressing because the only person who I think has got the hunger and vision and passion is the only one of you that's not an MP, and it's really disappointing. I mean, Danny, you made the point that people get the governments they vote for. You know, I think in 10, 15, 17, 19, people voted for a smaller state. They voted for lower regulation. They voted for the removal of these quangos. And so the answer to the point, can we ever really take back control, for me is a simple yes. The question really is, why haven't we over 13 years? But sadly, well, we've obviously heard from 3 MPs that we haven't, because it's all really very difficult, and it's very complicated, and really, really quite a struggle, and all very complicated, which is just nonsense to the people who, you know, do actually difficult jobs. So my question would be that, sadly, and I mean sadly, we're in the last year of Conservative government. What's going to happen in that year to try and undo some of this?
Right, well, I'll start with Danny, and I think all 3 MPs can have a reply to that one.
Okay. Well, listen, I'm sorry to give the impression that we don't think it's possible, because I mean, personally, I do, and I think we've tried to explain how. We've also explained the challenges and why it hasn't happened. But fundamentally, you're right. We did come in, particularly in 2019, with a mandate to totally reform the British state. And my great regret of the years since then is we delivered one thing, which was to get Brexit done, but the other part of our promise to the people was that we would make an effective government that would rebalance the economy, but also create a British state that worked, and that was, by implication, I don't think it was an explicit commitment to de-quangoify our country, but that is absolutely the spirit of Brexit and the spirit of the 2019 mandate. And I think you're right that the public feel, what have we got? We haven't had it. And in fact, we've seen huge growth in the state, and we can point to the reasons for that and so on. But fundamentally, there's no excuse. We have hugely enhanced the reach of government and the size of it. So what can we do in the next year? Well, I would like to see, starting with the PM's speech on Wednesday, a real commitment to reform the British government and to get it working on behalf of the British people. And that does require a lot of, he'd be very good at it, the behind the scenes, the diligent work to dismantle the bureaucracy that has grown up over 20 years. As we've said, I don't think that's something that the public are going to particularly resonate with. It will with some of us. But if we say we're going to spend our time sort of reforming the quangos, that isn't, I don't think, top priority for the public, but it is absolutely what we need to do. And if we do want to get down the cost of living, if we do want to reduce taxation and debt, which are the explicit concerns of the public and the Prime Minister, the way to do that, one of the ways to do that, is to reform the state in the way that we've set out. So I think we can get cracking, but fundamentally, and I don't think we should give up on the next election, because I think we can win it if we get our priorities and our messaging right. But what we need in the manifesto for the next election is an absolute mandate to do the job that's going to be required. It's not going to be the headline of the coverage, but it needs to be in the manifesto, because, as Chris was saying at the beginning, the civil service are actually up for it. They were up for it in 2019. They responded well to the clarity that the government was giving them. I think they would participate in the reforms that we need. But we do need that mandate to be explicitly expressed in the manifesto.
Bim.
So the second audition provides sufficient passion. Look, I definitely wasn't saying, and I don't think my colleagues did either, that it was all too difficult, too complicated. What we were trying to do is give a full explanation. The reason why I'm working with colleagues on the group that I've set up is precisely to change things. That's why we're bothering, right? That's why we're here. That's why we care about it. I do think that, and do I think we should? Yes. Do I think we can? Yes. Because, frankly, it's a year to go. What are we waiting for? You know, if we don't get this right, we're not going to be in office in a year from now, right? That's just the truth. So we've got to get it right. But what I'd do is I'd focus on outcomes. You know, I don't think the British public, as Danny said, is concerned about the workings of the British state particularly. They're not actually concerned about how big or small it is. What they're concerned about is how much it costs them and whether on the ground they're seeing improvements. They're the two things. And what we have to do is, beneath those outcomes, we have to do whatever we need to do to deliver on those outcomes. And I think that reforming how the government actually works is really, really integral part of that.
Miriam.
Well, I think to respond to that, I'd just give a couple of anecdotes that show what it's like from an MP's perspective, because, of course, you know, ultimately we're the ones that vote this legislation through. And recently, the energy bill came before Parliament the day after recess, and we discovered as MPs a day or so before that there was a clause in there that would essentially allow a regulator at an unnamed future date, through a Secretary of State, an unnamed Secretary of State, to create criminal law around failure to adhere to some unspecified net zero policy. So in theory, in the future, if you refuse to put double glazed windows in your unused warehouse, you could be locked up for 12 months. Now, it's an extreme example, but how ridiculous is that? But because the bill is 300 pages long, and every MP is also working on all sorts of other bits of legislation and their constituency matters and things like that, you know, the point at which we discovered that that was in there was not enough time to create some sort of, you know, ruckus in the media and get colleagues on board to oppose this clause. And the government didn't take it out. So, you know, I and a number of others ended up abstaining on the bill. Some people voted against. But that, you know, those are the kind of things that we're up against as MPs in terms of, you know, the distribution of our focus, the lack of expertise, and trying to really nail down what do we actually have to do to get this done and how do we get through Parliament is very difficult. Now, I know that sounds like an excuse, but that is the reality on the ground in terms of what we're facing. And this is why I think that we do have to look at this legislatively. The Equalities Act and the Human Rights Act, they're kind of framework underpinning the, you know, the woke quangos, and then the net zero underpinning the kind of natural England quangos. There is this legislative, it's very difficult to say this time in the morning, legislative framework foundation that has enabled these quangos to grow up. And I think if we tackle those legislative problems, so we reform our equalities and human rights law, we reform, you know, our net zero commitments potentially, that will then allow us to work on the quangos. But I think it has to be in that order.
All right, Mr. Enthusiasm.
Yes, well, I think you're being rather unfair to the rest of the panel, who I think we have quite a sound panel here, actually, and we're all more or less on the same page. But, you know, it's only 3 MPs out of 650. They're not in charge of the government. I think, rather coming to your point, actually, sir, is it does depend on what you actually want to do and how keen you are to do it and how focused you are on delivering it. You know, the government has delivered things. I mentioned the education reforms. Obviously, it delivered on Brexit despite huge opposition from the chattering classes. You know, you don't have just stop oil protests anymore. That seems to have been stamped out. Austerity was incredibly unpopular with lots of people, but government didn't maybe do it quite as much as the IA and the TPA would have liked, but they did make changes. And Eric Pickles, going back to the state-funded charity aspect, Eric Pickles actually did a pretty good job of going around and stripping funding from a lot of these political pressure groups. So things can be done, but as I said before, you need to have a very clear strategy. You need to know where you want to end up. You need to inform the civil service what you're doing and how you want them to go about it. And I fear that actually a lot of the time when other, you know, outside forces are blamed, it's actually the failure is with a lack of principle and knowing what you're actually trying to do. And therefore it's much easier to say, actually, we'll have net zero, we're going to ban plastic straws and disposable vapes and have a sugar tax and all this stuff, where you get patted on the back by Jamie Oliver and the BBC and you can feel good about yourself for a day. But it's not actually, when you look back on your 14 years in power, what you intended to do when you started off. What I would like to see in an ideal world is the Tories do something in their last year equivalent to the Labour bringing in the Equalities Act, which was always designed to tie the hands of the government. The government couldn't realistically get rid of it when they were in bed with the Lib Dems. Could have done probably in 2019, but I don't think there was much desire from Boris Johnson to have done so. So the Tories should do a Conservative version of the Equalities Act, the Freedom Act or something like that. Yes. The question is, however, what would you actually put in it? Because what does the government really believe are fundamental things it should be tying the hands of the next Labour government? I would like to think free speech might be in there. But it's pretty difficult to do that at the same time as introducing the online safety bill.
Okay, Bim, you wanted to come back in on
Just,
one of Chris's points.
I think that, and it was actually both that and something Miriam was saying earlier. She mentioned the Home Secretary and things she said about immigration. And without sort of going down that rabbit hole, I do think it's important when you're in office, if you are a government committed to doing certain things on migration, that the person who heads that up, the Home Secretary, doesn't speak like a commentator, right? We are in office. Brexit means we have complete control over who comes into this country. And the public will rightly give us short shrift if they feel that we are pleading that we can't do anything about it. You know, this isn't about regulators. We talked about quangos. We talked about all. Immigration really isn't tied up in those ways. And so I just think that, you know, I've got a huge amount of time for the Home Secretary, and I like her a lot. But I think the way we deal with these things is less about the sort of thing that a lot of the liberal media didn't like in it. I don't have an issue with that. But I do think we've got to be clear that we are in control now. It's just not good enough for us to say, oh, we're stopped from doing this, we're stopped from doing that. The public isn't going to accept that. They know that they want lower migration. They also know they want certain jobs to be filled where we have labour shortages. And we are responsible for steering that course and delivering on it. It's as simple as that.
I think that's what the Home Secretary was saying, though, Bim, which is that, as you say, you know, post-Brexit, we are independent. We have sovereignty over legal migration. Of course, we should have always had sovereignty over illegal migration. The challenge is our membership of the European Court. And what she's signalling, and I think the Conservative Party would be overwhelmingly behind her, is that if it turns out that the courts, either in Strasbourg or here in the UK, use the European Convention as a means of tying our hands, as they did last year, then we should disregard that. And if it's necessary for us to exit the ECHR altogether, we should be prepared to do so.
It's true. But actually, the most important thing is less the international obligation, but the way that international obligation is translated into UK law. And, you know, Russia, okay, is a signatory of the ECHR. They are. Now, I don't think they've been behaving in an entirely Strasbourg-compliant way over the last year or two. It's about how we implement these things in British law. And so what I'm hoping we can get to, if the court does something stupid in relation to the court case, is we say, look, we are going to legislate explicitly if necessary, take all the right legal advice to do the following things to make sure that the policy that is approved by the British government and by Parliament is going to be delivered on. And if that contravenes some aspect of our international obligation, well, tough. But that isn't the same thing as saying you're leaving the thing altogether. Do you see what I mean? That I think it's an important nuance, because it's about how we actually implement something in British law, rather than actually taking the easy way out saying the whole problem is the obligation. No, the problem is how we implement it here.
All right, let's go out for some more comments, questions. There's a gentleman at the back and then over to Elliot after.
Hi, thanks. Chris McKeon, Press Association. I just wanted to pick on something Miriam mentioned about the energy bill and the kind of echoing criticisms that have been made of the government a lot recently in terms of over-reliance on secondary legislation and not allowing enough parliamentary time for scrutiny, despite there being plenty available. The government's not really interested in this agenda, is it?
What, in the agenda of scrapping quangos? Well, I wouldn't say that. I think plenty of Secretary of States behind the scenes will be very frustrated about the role of quangos tying their hands. But, you know, we've got 1 year left before the election. We've got to choose what to focus on, and that's a combination of what really needs doing and what's going to win support in the country. And I think we keep saying we've been in power for 13 years and, you know, how can we blame anyone else? And that's a fair comment. But it's also true that the number of prime ministers, the number of times the government has changed, the number of Secretary of States that have changed is phenomenal. And just going back to the Home Secretary quote, no, Suella was not the Home Secretary. after 2019 when we made the decision to bring in a points-based system that was far too generous in terms of the salary levels of people who are allowed in. And so, she is a little bit caught, as are all secretaries of state, because on the one hand, of course, they need to support government policy and put out the signal that we are in control, but at the same time, they aren't actually responsible for what's happened in the last 3, 4, 10 years. So it's quite a difficult position to be in. So I do think reform is absolutely part of the government's agenda, but the government's also got to be wise about what they do choose to do in this final year before the election, and that's not an easy decision for anybody.
Okay, final question from Elliot at the back there.
Yeah, there seems to be, as far as I can tell, relatively good awareness of the problem of UK quangos amongst the voters and taxpayers, but there doesn't seem to be a great awareness of the problems of global quangos like the WHO, and particularly how much money we give to them. So I was just wondering what the panel thinks of how do we raise awareness of those more global networks.
Chris?
Well, I mean, I already mentioned them. I mean, when Donald Trump threatened to defund the WHO in 2020, Boris Johnson responded by massively increasing what we were giving to them. And this is at a time when the WHO had completely messed up the whole thing. I mean, I won't go into all the details. I've written a lovely report about it called "You Had One Job." Looks at the many failings of the WHO and indeed of Public Health England. Which another quango, which I would rejoiced when Public Health England was closed down because it was spending all its time regulating, the amount of sugar that can go into biscuits and so on, when it should have been preparing for a pandemic, and it didn't. But then it just respawned like a phoenix from the flames. It was supposed to be the Office for Health Improvement. It was going to be called. Which sounds all right, give people advice about how to live a healthy lifestyle, but it very quickly changed. A blob got involved and it became the Office for Health Improvement and Disparities. Normally it would be inequalities, but apparently disparities sounded newer, is what I heard. Sounding more trendy. But as soon as you start bringing in health inequalities, which is an inherently left-wing concept, it immediately just becomes a matter of, well, we need to get ordinary people living the healthy lifestyles of the metropolitan, tofu munchers and so on, which is what Public Health England were all about, and it's what its replacement is all about. It's very hard to destroy these things, even if they're incredibly unpopular like PHE. Long term, the WHO should be replaced by something else. People like Bill Gates should be putting their money into an organisation that is going to be purely focused on pandemic preparation and that kind of thing. But it's obviously a difficult thing to do, but I really think we should be, as the third biggest funder of the WHO, I really think we should be having a bit of influence over it, and we don't seem to be on any level.
All right. Oh, sorry, I missed that. We do actually have time, yeah, if we could run the mic over. You just got the mic just behind you there.
Yeah, I just wanted to state a fact, I noticed, correct a fact. Russia has ceased to be a member of the ECHR in September 2022.
Forgive me.
Okay.
Thank you for pointing that out. I won't repeat it when I'm later on, in case there are more journalists in the room and I'm saying something inaccurate. Thank you.
Well, on that corrective note...
Saying that before that, they weren't behaving terribly well either, though. Just to be clear.
The point stands. So the point stands.
Whereas the Vatican is not a member of the ECHR, and they behave pretty well as a moral state. So I don't think it's a sufficient proxy for goodness.
Vatican Bank.
All right. Well, to be continued. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. If you could just join me in thanking the panel.
Thank you.